Did Jesus die for everyone? Before I seek to answer that question, let me first acknowledge that this is a question about which believers often disagree. In fact, if you are familiar with the technical language to describe this view that denies that Jesus died for the sins of everyone, which would be limited atonement, that among those 5 key points that make up the 5 points of Calvinism, this is the toughest one for people to swallow. When you hear someone say, I'm sort of a Calvinist, or I'm kind of a Calvinist, or I'm a 4-point Calvinist, or a 4.5-point Calvinist, the one they're having trouble with is the L. Limited atonement. And I understand where that concern comes from, both in terms of particular passages in the Bible that seem to suggest otherwise, and because of just the idea that God would intentionally pass people over. And in fact, I think at the end of the day, it's really more the second one that's the problem. Well, one of the jobs that we have in trying to understand what the Bible teaches is we have to harmonize things that look like they're at odds with each other. Paul says we're justified by faith. James says we're justified by works. Are they contradicting? No, they're not. And in fact, somewhere back in the Wayback Machine, I'm sure we have an Ask RC on that very subject. But here we have a text that I think settles the problem. And it's not just me who thinks this. This is if you are theologically inclined and astute and are eager and ready for some deep study, then let me encourage you to get a copy of The Death of Death in the Death of Christ by the Puritan John Owen. He was one of the giants in the history of the church, and this was his magnum opus that argues for the position that I'm taking. And it builds his case very much on a text that you wouldn't think answers the question, right? Those texts that look like they're taking the opposite view of the one I'm taking. God's not willing that any should perish, or God so loved the world that whosoever believeth, those kinds of, God does not take pleasure in the death of the wicked. Those kinds of things are the kind of proof text for the other view. And of course, the people who embrace my view have our own proof text, but we often miss this one. It's Jesus praying his high priestly prayer. Jesus praying the high priestly prayer. This is just before his crucifixion, after the Lord's Supper. And he's praying fervently and vigorously, like with sweat, like blood coming out of his head. And he's asking for God's grace and to God be glorified. And then he prays for his people, the ones that God has given to him. And then he takes the amazing step of saying in the midst of his prayer, I am not praying for everyone, but only for those you have given me. If the view is we have to reject the idea that Jesus didn't die for everyone because that would make him unfair, that Jesus has to treat everyone the same, or else Jesus would be in sin, then we have Jesus in sin right here. And by the way, if he's in sin, not only is the atonement limited, it doesn't even exist. If he's not without sin, we have no atonement. But Jesus doesn't pray for those that the Father hasn't given to him. Doesn't mean that the ones that he does pray for, the ones that he did die for, are better than the ones he didn't. That's where unconditional election comes in. It's not because of anything good in us, but because he determined to set his love upon us. A Jesus who wouldn't pray for those who God knew would not come to saving faith is a Jesus whose intention wasn't to die for all men everywhere, but rather to rescue and to redeem his bride.